Dr. Joe Green, and just want to share a couple of thoughts with you. As you see in the title, I have Larry Elder, Ron DeSantis, and some of the other topics I want to talk about, and they're mainly centered around race. Um, and so, before we go any further, if you get a chance on my YouTube channel, if you can please like, subscribe, and share this video if there's anything of uh, any beneficial information to you. So it was interesting. Recently, there was a interview on the Breakfast Club with Larry Elder, and the Breakfast Club is Charlemagne the God, DJ Envy, and there's a young lady on there who's relatively new. And it was a pretty interesting interaction back and forth. And from all accounts, and I saw the interview, Larry Elder really kind of wrecked the whole crew because they brought up, they call it the N-word wake-up call. And they were basically, so in so many words, they were calling Larry Elder like a sellout, or as they like to use the word, coon or something like that. And it was simply because he doesn't adhere to the ideology that is supposedly common among Black people. So people outside the community, they pretty much have tried to label Black people as being monolithic in how they think, like everybody thinks the same. And if you have a thought that goes against the grain, then somehow or another it makes you less Black. One of the things that Larry Elder brought up to Charlemagne was when Joe Biden was running for president in 2020, and he was on the Breakfast Club, and uh, and Charlemagne basically asked him, "Why should we vote for you?" And Joe Biden said, "Come on, man, if you have to question whether or not you need to vote for me, then then you're probably not Black, or you're not Black, or something along those lines," which unfortunately it should have been insulting to intelligent Black people. Should have been insulted by that comment, but unfortunately most of them weren't. You know, that kind of thought is saying that if you don't agree with what I say to you, then somehow or another that makes you less Black. And so Larry Elder, he really went in hard on Charlemagne because he brought that part up. Like, how are you trying to question me? And this is what has happened. And, you know, most of the mainstream media, most of the people, most of them are gatekeepers, and what they are is they're people that have to carry on the same narrative, and they can't go off script. So if you go off script and you don't have the same thought process as they tell you that all Black people should have, then somehow or another they try to paint you as that you're not Black, or somehow or another you're a sellout or something like that. And that word woke comes up a lot, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But let's go a little bit deeper. See, most of the time we have a problem because we are very surface in our thinking, especially African Americans. Most of us are very surface in our thinking. We don't do a lot of research and reading, and it was very evident because Charlemagne, who kind of presents himself as somewhat of a Black intellectual, was completely outclassed by Larry Elder. You know, Larry Elder is an attorney. He's been around for a long time. He's running for president currently. He completely outclassed them because it was based on facts and statistics and stuff like that. And so they don't want you as an African American to use historically accurate information or facts, or really look at things in the big picture. You just have to. You're just expected to go with the narrative that they give you. But let's look at this from a larger scale, because I've talked about this a lot, talked about this in detail, and just a couple of facts I want to talk to you about. First of all, is Black is and race in general is a social construct, and so the term Black, which is primarily only designated for African Americans, is a term is basically used to separate us. Race is a social construct that was used to separate us. I'm going to talk about the history of race briefly in this talk, but anytime you start and end a conversation primarily based on race and try to talk about commonality among race, then you're already you're missing key ingredients of the facts, right? Because to believe that all Black people have to think exactly alike is not only insulting, but it's absurd, right? But they paint that picture in order to keep people confined in the agenda that's being promoted. And so, for instance, in the political realm, um, you know, they want all Black people to think that you have to be a Democrat, you have to be liberal, et cetera, et cetera. When from a historical perspective, it's just the opposite. You know, it was the Republican Party that was the anti-slavery party. And all of the and this is a fact that you can look up for yourself. All the civil rights, all the major civil rights legislation that was passed in America was passed by the Republicans, not the Democrats. It was passed by the Republicans. The civil rights bill itself was actually opposed by most Democrats, including Lyndon Baines Johnson, until it was finally signed into law. And this is on another video. I'll address why that was. But ultimately, these are historical facts, right? But yet they have done such a great job of revisionist history that now, if you are not a Democrat, if you don't follow the Democrat liberal policies in somehow or another, then you are not black enough. And that's exactly what Joe Biden said in 2020. And nobody held him accountable from the black community. Maybe a small amount of people, but ultimately it didn't. But let me talk about this race thing. Now, you have to realize it and look at things from a larger global perspective in order to understand what is happening. See, there are people that they call them the ruling elite, the global cabal, the international bankers, whatever you want to call them, that are actually the ones who control most of the narratives, especially as it pertains to the media and different things like that. And in their mind, black and white has nothing to do with anything. They have bloodline families, but then they also have organizations that they use to carry out their agendas. Like mainstream media is 90% plus of mainstream, or some people call it legacy media. And when I say legacy media or mainstream media, I'm talking about ABC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, all those type of things, as opposed to alternative media, which has become very popular with the onset of podcasts or YouTube videos or all these other platforms that people can use to get their truths out. But when you look at overall who controls the narratives, it's this group. You can call them various names. Some people call them the Illuminati, and I don't really know if they call themselves that necessarily. But ultimately, it's a global cabal. It's these people at the top, the one half of 1%ers, and most of you haven't even heard of some of the names of these people. They put people in front of you that you hear about, but the ones who are really pulling the strings behind the scenes are ones that most of you haven't heard about, right? But it's this global cabal, these people that are these global elite, and they have this idea of what is called hegemony. Now, what hegemony is the idea that certain people, this global elite class, are the ones who should be in charge, and they're the only ones who could really create a perfect utopian society here on the earth. But also, because of their ideology, they also believe that the rest of the population has to be limited to a certain amount, because if they're not limited to a certain amount, then they're harder to control. And so what happens is, when the study of psychology in Europe during the Enlightenment age, if you think about Illuminati and then you talk about Enlightenment, the Enlightenment age, they started to study psychology as a way to control what is called group think. And so in order for them to control the masses, they use a couple of things. They use symbols and they use language or words. Symbols or language or words. Like, let me give you an example. President Barack Obama represented a symbol, right? He was symbolic. He was symbolic of the fact that he looked different than the previous presidents before him. And so because he was a symbol that was given to us, especially as African Americans, the fact that he didn't do anything for black people in his 8 years in office, or that we weren't his focus, was irrelevant, because the only thing that they needed to do was promote this symbol to black people. And because we are very emotionally driven, we were satisfied with that, right? And some of them still, you can show them and prove to them that that Black America wasn't his priority, and they still are completely loyal and defensive of him, right? So that's how they use symbology. The other thing they use is language. George Orwell's dystopian book 1984 talks about this thing called newspeak. And what newspeak is that they began to control the language, because if you can control the language, then you can control the thoughts of the people, of the group think, and then you can change the narrative. Like, for instance, homophobia is a word that is used in order to promote the agenda and acceptance of same-sex marriage. Because if you look at decades ago, and not that long ago, everyone accepted, or the vast majority of people, and this is well documented, even through votes, every time they voted and put it up for vote, like in 2008, it was called Proposition 8, that was put up to defend marriage between one man and one woman. It passed with like 70% of a vote. So the vast majority of the people have accepted that marriage should be confined to a man and a woman. But then as they began to change it through the media and the language, they start to invoke words like homophobia, which means that you can't say anything against it. If you say that I disagree with it ideologically or spiritually or religiously, then they will say that that is homophobic. So the more they say that, it changes and shapes the language to the place where now the thoughts have changed. And now people, even in the churches, who clearly see in the Bible that the Bible speaks against same-sex relationships, but yet because they have infiltrated it through the language and through the symbology, love is love, and all these other type of things, it has gotten people to accept it, and no longer, and less people oppose it, right? So that's how you change things, through symbology, through language. The media is very key in this whole thing. And so now let's look a little bit more into it. So some of the symbolism, some of the ideology that is promoted, and so this whole idea that they keep promoting Black people, that you have to be liberal, you have to be Democrat, or else somehow or another that you are not, you don't know what's going on, you are not woke, you are not Black, or something along those lines, right? And they keep promoting that idea that many people go for it hook, line, and sinker. But let's talk about this. Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, has said that he said Florida is a place where wokeness goes to die. And again, this word woke has been thrown out there so much and now has been accepted primarily by people of color and other people, that they began to equate being woke with being Black. And so when someone says they're anti-woke, then they have equated, and I've heard this said over and over again by people, if you're anti-woke, then that means you have to be anti-Black. And those two things are mutually exclusive of each other. Wokeness does not equate to Blackness. And I'm going to talk to you about wokeness. And so hopefully not only will I help to change your vocabulary and your thinking, that you will now be able to see through these type of strategies that's used to basically brainwash you, or to control your thought patterns, so that you will think in accordance to what they want you to think. So woke, the question is whether woke is a good or bad thing. In 2023, Ipsos Center Bias poll, a poll by Ipsos, IPSOS, 56% of respondents said that the word woke means to be informed, educated on, and aware of social injustices. 39% said it means to be overly politically correct and police officers and police others' words. To be overtly politically correct and police others' words. Now, that part is really more accurate, because even the whole concept of politically correct lines up with this ideology that we can control language so that we ultimately can control thought. Woke is a term that generally refers to awareness of issues related to racism, discrimination, and social justice, and supportive policies or cultural changes to address purported injustices and institute more social equity or equality. However, the term is used both positively and negatively by those across the political spectrum, and carries very different meaning depending on who is wielding that language. Being woke is generally seen as a good thing by much of the liberal left. In this view, someone who is woke is awake or has woken up to purported racial and social injustices in the United States. The idea that our laws and institutions purportedly uphold systemic inequality and injustice based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. Now, let me take it deeper. Now, the woke is tied into social justice, critical race theory, and those type of things. But you got to realize that those are tools that were created in order to shape public opinion. Now, why do I say that? The reason I say that, because when you look at critical theory and other things that are critical theory, it was created. There was a thing called the Frankfurt School in Germany. It was a think tank of intellectuals that were trying to promote the ideas of Marxism. There's also an institute called the Tavistock Institute. These are think tanks where these intellectuals come together and they strategize on certain things. And so part of it is they recognized they were trying to promote the ideas of Marxism. And Marxism is an ideology that is symbolic. Again, those symbols that will give people the impression that it is for the common man's benefit that you promote the ideas of Marxism, which is socialism, communism, and those type of things, right? So they promote the ideas, workers of the world unite. Part of what has happened, and most people don't realize this, is that many of the communist Russians, which is a part of Marxism, that Russia, during the time of the civil rights movement, had infiltrated the civil rights movement in many places, and they wanted to use the civil rights movement to destabilize America so that Russia could come in and take over. We were in what was called a Cold War, and what a Cold War means is we weren't firing missiles at each other, but we were at war with each other, right? So what they did was they started to infiltrate the civil rights movement in order to try to promote Marxist ideology, which is why if you look at the symbol of Lenin and all those other things, workers of the world unite, it's the closed fist like that. That's the same symbol that many of the civil rights movement people adopted because they had been able to subtly to infiltrate and to promote the ideas of Marxism. But what you have to understand is that Marxism doesn't actually help the common man. The only thing that Marxism does is help to be a shift of power from one political structure to another. Because if you look in Marxism, look at all around the world where Marxism exists. Russia, China, those type of things, right? They all were based on Marxism. And how did that fare for the average person? You still, what you always have, this elite class of wealthy people and powerful people at the top. But the difference in Marxism and what we have in our system is that in our system, we have a huge amount of people that are considered middle class. And the middle class have a lot more say whether or not they want to move up or down the social ladder, right? But if you look in Marxism, you don't have that. In Russia, you didn't have that. In China, you didn't have that. You still have wealthy people and powerful people at the top. But the average person suffers when it comes to Marxism, which is why even in this country that Marxism is becoming very, very prevalent. You see most of these policies hurt the middle class. The wealthy people are good, right? Jeff Bezos during the shutdown doubled his wealth. Elon Musk doubled his wealth. Bill Gates and all these other guys doubled their wealth. So the wealthy people will survive in any system. It's the middle class that will suffer when these type of when you take away this free market capitalism and you implement Marxism, it just destroys the middle class. And now you'll have poor people. Now, poor people will be okay for the most part. And when I say okay, I'm using relative terms because the reason poor people are okay, because you may have in Marxism a system of welfare where the state actually takes care of the people, right? So you have free housing, you have free food, you have all these type of things that are given to you, but yet your austerity, your ability of free will and self-determination are taken away from you. That's the problem. I would rather be poor if I can make the decision than to have somebody make me poor, right? So Marxism makes you poor against your will. And so anyway, when you think about overall this ideal of Marxism, which they want it to be the world system, so this ruling elite class will still be in charge, but they will have control over all the masses, right? They were trying to promote that in the West, right? The Western Europe and America. But the biggest pushback to Marxism and taking control of things was what is called the Judeo-Western culture, Judeo-Christian Western culture. So they recognized that that was the biggest hindrance to them promoting Marxism, which is why in another part of Marxism is an anti-God, anti-Christ religion, because ultimately you can't have faith. The state will control the church. And when the state controls the church, they will tell you how to worship, which is why our founding fathers put in our Bill of Rights, the first, the first one is freedom of religion, among other things, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and those things that were in our Bill of Rights, right? The First Amendment of the Constitution gives us that. Because what Marxism does is it takes away your ability to worship the way you want to. And that's one of the reasons why our founding fathers put that as the First Amendment, in the First Amendment, I should say. The government controls you and they're in charge of you. And they also teach you that you can't speak out against the government, which is why you have freedom of redress, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech in the First Amendment, because they recognize that if you can hinder those things, then it gives ability for tyrannical leaders to take over. Okay, so anyway, we're talking about critical theory, right? So critical theory is the strategy that the Marxists wanted to use in order to destroy the Judeo-Christian Western culture. And so they tear down some of the tenements. One of them is critical race theory, is one of the critical theory. So when you look at critical race theory, you look at um, even in gender roles, all those type of things are institutions that the Judeo-Christian West has, that the Marxists recognize that they have to erode and destroy those things in order for them to seize control, right? To get the people to be more compliant and to seize control. And so when we talk about wokeness, and you talk about, these are terms that are thrown out there to basically brainwash you into thinking the way that they want you to think. Now, critical theory, again, like I said, critical race theory, and there's other parts of that. I won't get into all of them, but just to briefly, gender roles. So they go against the male patriarchy, right? So the women's movement, the second wave feminist movement, that look to emasculate men and turnover, the institution of family, right? So most families, you had the father who's the head of the family and the mother who's the partner of the husband, but he's the head of the household, right? So they overturn that, and they talk about the male patriarchy and how oppressive it is to women. You talk about gender roles, right? You talk about sexualities. And so one of the things that Marxism does, and Black Lives Matter people were trained Marxists, they admitted that, is they said they wanted to destroy heteronormative thinking. And what is heteronormative thinking? It's the idea that one man and one woman is what marriage should be. They wanted to overturn and to overthrow that as well, which is why you have all these things that are being pushed, and they're being supported by the mainstream media. And if you say anything against it, then obviously they will say that you are homophobic, transphobic, you are racist, they use all these isms and these ists, right? So you're racist, you're homophobic, you are transphobic, you are racist, you are sexist, you're misogynist, all these other terms that they throw out there as a way to control how you think. And so, like I said, the conversation between Larry Elder and Charlemagne the God is very critical. Now, I will say, in regards to Florida and Ron DeSantis, he said he was against wokeness, which I'm explaining to you what wokeness is. So don't be deceived by the term being woke and what it actually means. And so they rejected one curriculum that had like a lot of critical race theory in it. And also they had some other things, like they implemented like the not homophobic, the homosexual agenda, the transgender agenda, and they mixed it in with this thing that was supposed to be Black history. See, I'm a student of history. I'm a proponent of teaching history, but we have to teach history in a way that is open and honest and transparent. We cannot, it's insincere from a scholarly standpoint to editorialize history. Just like slavery, this is what slavery was, right? This is the time that slavery was. You had indentured servitude, then you had chattel slavery, and then you had these type of things. Then you had the Emancipation Proclamation, you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, you had Jim Crow, then you had the Civil Rights Movement, right? These are all ways that we were moving away from mistreating people based on this social construct of race, right? And so, but here's the key. We can talk about that open and honestly, but we can't editorialize it. Like, we shouldn't look at the history that occurred and use it to predict that Black people can never succeed in America, which is basically what critical race theory is talking about. When people say that this country is systemically racist, it was systemically racist, but it no longer is. Because for something to be systemic, it has to be either codified by law or expressed in policy. Let me give you an example. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and during the 60s or during the civil rights movement, he stood on the steps of University of Alabama and said, no black person will ever go to the University of Alabama. That's systemic because he's the governor of the state and he's in charge of that. He's expressed that in policy. There was a time in the Jim Crow South where they could have a restaurant and on this door, it would say, no blacks allowed, whites only, right? Now, if you walked into that restaurant, they could call the police and the police would come and arrest you because you broke the law that said no black people were allowed in there, right? That's systemic because that's codified in law. But now what happens is in order to get rid of systemic racism, then you pass laws that overturn those. So the civil rights movement, the discrimination laws, the housing laws, and those type of things that said you can't discriminate on people based on race. So now if you had that restaurant, and if you had that same restaurant in the in this day and age, right? If you walked in there and it said white people can't go in there, you could call the cops and they would get in trouble. See, that's how you overturn those things. And so it's important for us to understand exactly what that means, what that represents, because if not, you can be deceived by thinking that one thing is something that it really isn't. And so, but I do believe that you have to come to a place where you are talking about these type of things historically in a historically accurate way without editorializing with it, and also without talking about how that will shape the future by talking about the past. And so these are things that we are losing in translation because people are using things in a way that really is meant to keep us fighting each other, to keep us divided, and also to keep us in a perpetual state of victimhood. Because guess what? If critical race theory is real, it's telling you as a black person, no matter how hard you try, that there is a system of oppression that will keep you from succeeding. And that's just not the case. And the sad part about it is many people are actually promoting this idea that are supremely successful. Some of these, NBA players or professional athletes or entertainers, these people are wildly successful, wealthy beyond measure, but yet they're telling you that this is a place where you cannot succeed because of the color of your skin. You think about somebody like LeBron James. LeBron James is a billionaire. He's a billionaire in this capitalistic free market system. And he's wealthy not because he, cured cancer or he does brain surgery or he rescues children out of a burning building. He's successful because God gifted him to be 6'9", 270 pounds, and can run and jump out of a gym. And he honed his skills and maximized his talent in a way that he benefited from it. He wouldn't be able to get that anywhere else. But yet he's one of the people that continue to promote this idea that how racist this country is and you can't succeed. And he succeeded. You could probably take 1 million people. He's made more in his lifetime, and he's still young. He's still in his late 30s. He's made more in his lifetime. I mean, he's made more in those years than probably 100,000 people or 1 million people made in their lifetime, right? He's a billionaire. But yet these are the people they put in front of you, and they continue to promote that same ideology that limits us and keeps us divided because they tell you that, white people are racist and black people are victims all the time. And the system is set up to destroy you and never get you, never help you to succeed. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the Bible says about that. There's a scripture when they asked Jesus about the last days and what will happen. And Jesus says, nation will rise against nation. Now, this is an interesting thing for you to understand because, like I said, even biologically, there's no such thing as race, and spiritually, there's no such thing as race. And what do I mean by that? Because the Bible doesn't divide people by race, it divides people by tribes, right? So different tribes, and God blessed certain tribes or he rejected certain tribes, not because of skin color, it was because whether or not they followed his commandments or not. And with Abraham, God's intention through Abraham was that all the nations of the world would be blessed through Abraham's seed, right? The Apostle Paul said in the book of Acts that from one blood, God created all the nations to exist on the earth. So when Jesus says, the gospel is to preach the gospel to all nations, which means all ethnic groups, all ethnicities, right? Because that's God's intention for humanity. And when Jesus says nation will rise against nation, that word nations in Greek is the word ethnos, where we get the word ethnicity from. And so Jesus was warning us that in the last days that nation will rise against nation, that there will be these type of conflicts that will rise up because all these different ethnic groups will rise up against each other. Now, why does that happen? That doesn't happen because that's God's will, because God doesn't separate us by race or skin color or anything like that. God, he divides us by ethnicity, and that ethnicity is, tribes, and those tribes are based on whether they follow God's law or not. But God's intention was for all of the tribes to come together to worship God. Now, what has happened in the book of Revelation, what we see in the book of Revelation, it says that Satan, the devil, is a accuser of the brethren. That word accuser in Greek is the word kategoros, is where you get the word category from. So one of the strategies of the enemy is to divide humanity up into categories and have us fighting each other. And so Satan's desire is for us to have a race war or have these different wars of people groups coming against each other, right? Which is why Jesus was warning us, nation shall rise against nation in these last days. And that's what we see. So what I'm saying to you is, first of all, don't fall for the deception that the enemy has put out there, that he continues to keep you and control you through language and symbolism, because that's how he does things. And understand that we are all, as human beings, all the same. We just have different ethnicities. We come from different regions of origin. And those are the things that cause us to have different characteristics and traits. And ultimately, if you are a Christian, you really should not fall into that trap, because again, Jesus's great commandment was that all the nations will be blessed through Abraham's seed, and that we are to preach the gospel to all nations. On the day of Pentecost, it said that all the nations under heaven were there on the day of Pentecost, and the Holy Spirit began to unite them together. When you look at the book of Revelation, it says John the Revelator saw a vision of heaven in the end times, and it says every tribe, every tongue, and every nation was together worshiping the Lamb of God. And so I just want you to be to be aware, to have your eyes open. I want you to be woke, but not the way they want you to be woke. I want you to have your eyes open and be aware of what is happening, not the way they are dictating to you, but the way that it really is, because we understand that God wants us to bring us together when the enemy wants to divide us and accuse us to each other and have us hating each other. And things aren't what they seem. There's ideologies and there are agendas that's being promoted that aren't based on facts or reality, but they are used to stir us up in a way that we don't trust each other, we don't want to work together, and that we will ultimately fail, because God doesn't want us hating each other and fighting each other. Hate only breeds more hate. And the last thing I would say to you is that, when we think about what is happening and what is occurring, because we are all basically the same, the CDC says that all human beings are like 99.5% the same, right? Because we all come from, as the Bible says, one blood. And so we should be always thinking about that, because you think about most of the people, especially in America, African Americans in our community, we have the highest rate of homicide, and we are number one as far as being victims of homicide. But the perpetrators are usually people that look just like the victim. And so this whole idea that everything is based on outside force is really not a true one. So anyway, until next time, this is Joe Green. Peace and blessings to you, and keep your eyes open and keep your mind on Jesus.